CCAPS. Thank you. Welcome to CCAPS. We are a learning community in the college and career access, persistence, and success space. We got some requests to hear from Ginger and the university world about what is going on, and that was really the request. So we're here with a few amazing people to tell us what is happening in the public for your higher ed space with respect to funding equity. So I'm going to hand it to you, Ginger.
Great, thank you. I'm glad it was a little more specific than what's just going on in the four-year space, because that could have been a week-long seminar. But we will keep this tight and really focus on the work on the Commission on Equitable Public University Funding. So I am going to share some slides and do my very best to give you an overview of the funding model in about 10 minutes. This is about 27 months worth of work, and we haven't practiced long enough that I can make it short, but I will do my best to get us there. So, and then from that, we will go into a discussion. We have two university presidents with us, President Lisa Freeman, President of Northern Illinois University, President Jay Gatrell from Eastern Illinois University, and IBHE Board Chair Pranav Kothari here as well. So we'll jump into a discussion after I lay some set some context. So I will jump into my slides. All right, hopefully you can all see that. Great.
We're good, Ginger. Thank you.
All right, terrific. So there we go. So what I want to cover today is obviously just a little bit of background, but some terms that are really important to the funding formula, and you will hear over and over and over again. So I put them right up front. We're going to talk about what an equity-centered adequacy target is. We're going to talk about a resource profile, resources available to the institutions. We're going to talk about who should pay the costs in an adequacy target, how much should be on students. And so there's a concept we'll also talk about called equitable student share. We're going to talk about the gap between resources and the adequacy target, or the adequacy gap. And then we'll talk about how to close the adequacy gaps. And then we'll talk a little bit about what the commission did not resolve in the course of its work. So again, I say those words because you will see them over and over again. Just to ground this a little bit in context, the work of developing a Thriving Illinois, the higher ed strategic plan, this work in the Funding Commission really sits squarely within it, within actually two goals. The first goal about closing equity gaps, but explicitly in the second goal about building stronger financial futures for institutions and individuals, which is about making sure that we have adequate, equitable, and stable funding for our institutions, and that college is affordable for our students. Obviously, the third goal is to increase talent and innovation. So this work we're going to talk about really sits squarely in helping the state achieve its goals for higher education. The commission was legislatively created, and this is an excerpt from the statute and what the charge was. And you see some other words that I've used already. Adequate, equitable, and stable is the model that we are supposed to develop, a way of adequately, equitably, and stably funding public universities. Through the strategic planning process, we identified a set of principles, and the legislation called on ensuring that whatever's recommended fulfills those principles, along with reflecting the work of an equity panel that Chicago State University convened back in 2020. So very much centered in work that was underway. The recommendations also have to meet 13 specific criteria. Some examples here, very much focused on equity. I won't read through all of them, but the recommendations that the commission developed and that we'll be presenting do fulfill all of these requirements. So what does the formula itself actually do? What are some of the design elements? First, each institution has a funding level that's unique to its student body. So it really builds up from the student characteristics. It does, as the statute laid out and the strategic plan identifies, encourages greater access and success for historically underrepresented students. It ensures that every institution gets an increase in funding whenever the state invests new dollars in its appropriations for universities, but it doesn't specify how universities have to spend those dollars. It allows the institutional flexibility so that they can best meet the needs of their students. And then it also has an affordability component by creating an incentive to reduce reliance on student tuition, obviously as state investment goes up. So these are some of the high level design components. So now let's dive in specifically to the formula. So again, these words, the basic concept is we develop for each institution an adequacy target, which is the cost that it takes to deliver services for the students or services and education for the student body of that institution. So we say adequate, it really means full cost. Then there's a resource profile for each institution that looks at what is available to the institution to cover those costs in the adequacy target. And then the difference, and every institution has one, is a gap, what we refer to as the adequacy gap, the difference between the resources that are available and the target that we believe each institution should be spending according to the model. So let me show this in a little bit more visual way. So on the left is the adequacy target, and we built that up by identifying all of the components really of a university, of running a university, looking at instruction and student supports, looking at mission components, so research, public service, and artistry, looking at underlying operations and maintenance costs, which includes like physical plant, what it costs to mow the grass, as well as all of the infrastructure it takes to run a university, like a president and HR and finance and all of those areas. So all embedded in the adequacy target. And within that, and we'll see in a second, we included elements to get at equity. On the right side, you see the resource profile. So each institution will have one that's specific to it, that looks at what is the state currently provide to that institution. So that is current state appropriations. The next bucket is equitable student share, which is, and we'll unpack this in a minute, a concept that we created to determine what's a reasonable and affordable amount students should pay relative to the adequacy target, not tuition and fees and what they are paying. So it's specific to the formula. And then other resources are resources that are available to institutions like endowment, and we'll talk about that in a little bit later as well. So when you compare the adequacy target, what we should be spending, to the resource profile, which is what is available, there is a gap. And new state resources should be allocated over time to close that gap so that eventually every institution is fully funded. So let me go on and really unpack this idea of the adequacy target. So same graphic, and the way we built this and the way we embedded equity was to look first for each of these components. So we looked at what does it cost to recruit and admit and enroll students. Once students are enrolled, what kind of academic supports do they need? What kind of non-academic supports do they need? And then what is obviously the major cost? What are the core instructional program costs at each institution? We looked at all of those components as well as the mission components. What are we spending to support a research mission, artistry mission for each institution, and then those operation and maintenance costs, and calculated a base cost per student, which really came from the average of what we're spending today. And then we adjusted it up because, as many of you know, Illinois has historically underfunded its public universities. So we knew just looking at current costs wasn't going to be enough. So we adjusted it up. But then we said that isn't reflecting the needs of an array of students that haven't been well served by higher education. And so we need to adjust those costs up to make sure that institutions do have the resources they need. So the equity adjustments, and we'll talk about what those are, were added to the base cost for each of the elements on this list. Additionally, we did some other adjustments to reflect unique characteristics of institutions as well as their mission. So we started with a base cost for each of these elements, and then they were adjusted up based on various characteristics. So what were those characteristics? So on the left, you see some of the equity adjustments that are included. So we made adjustments for the number of adult students. So that would be students over age 25, students who come from rural communities, EBF tier 1 and tier 2. So for folks for whom some of this language sounds familiar, it's very much built on the K-12 model, which is called evidence-based funding, or EBF. But in the equity adjustments, we also recognized that students who are coming from the least funded high schools, EBF tier 1, and then the second least funded, tier 2, need additional supports as well. And all of this is grounded in research. All of this is grounded in the gaps that we actually see in our data. So additional equity adjustments based on the resource tier of the high school students came from. Other characteristics, as you can see, low-income students, underrepresented minority, as well as underrepresented minority students in high-cost programs like STEM or engineering, to make sure that we are creating supports and incentives to enroll more underrepresented students in those fields. Now, I'll just note here, there were some student characteristics that people are very interested in. Students with disabilities, students who are also parents, a number of characteristics where we don't have data or we don't yet have data. And the commission did recommend that as both that we try and collect this data, but as we get it, that be considered also to be included in the formula. On the right, you see different kinds of institutional adjustments, again, for those high cost programs, school size, so a function for small schools because there's no economies of scale, where there's concentrations, high concentrations of low income students or other underrepresented students, to recognize that there's a cost adjustments that need to be made. And as you can see, the Carnegie classification for the research level of the institution and some focus on lab space. So these factors were all costed out, all embedded in our adequacy target, so that we could make sure that when we talk about adequate funding, we're reflecting the student body and we're incorporating equity. So it's super quick on the adequacy target, and hopefully we'll unpack that a little bit more. Now I want to talk a little bit about the resource profile, but particularly to focus on this concept of equitable student share, because that is something that was created through the commission process. And really neither of these concepts, the adequacy target, the resource profile, actually any of them, or equitable student share, are found in funding models anywhere else in the country. So this has all been created and it's specific to Illinois. So we're excited about that because we think this is potentially a national model if successful here. So what is the idea of equitable student share? So again, as we look at the resources that are available to institutions, there's an amount that institutions currently get from tuition and fees, but we're concerned that too large of a share of the costs have been put on the backs of students over time. And so we don't want to start with something that's already inequitable. And so we came up with a different concept, which is what is reasonable and affordable that students should be contributing to the cost of their education, to the cost of that adequacy target. And the rest should really come from the state, and then that small part from other resources. So it's trying to answer the question is what portion should come from the student? And so that's really the concept that we created here. And there's a lot that we can unpack, but I'll just hit really the top points here. Is that we looked at different characteristics of students and we said the state has a greater interest in subsidizing those students, certain students more than others, in-state versus out-of-state, perhaps undergraduate versus graduate, students who've been historically underserved. And so we calculated that those students should be responsible for a smaller share. And that's how the equitable student share was calculated, looking at different amounts for each student within an institution and then rolling that all together. The basic concept, the greater the share of high subsidy students like low income, underrepresented, the lower that we expect you to generate from your tuition, i.e. the more the state should be contributing. So what does this all look like wrapped together? We actually have a model. It's on the Funding Commission website, which is linked from the IBHE website. And you can see we have this for each institution, tables that look just like this, but also when you look at the state as a whole. The total cost of the adequacy target is about $4.5 billion. And you can see how it's broken down between base cost and the various equity or other adjustments. On the other hand, on the resource side, we have just over $3 billion or about $3.1 billion in resources available, again, using that concept of equitable student share, which leaves a gap of about $1.4 billion for the state to fill in over time. And as a state as a whole, we're about 68% funded. And if you look at the small chart on the right, what it shows you is the current state appropriations per student is about $6,300. When the adequacy target's fully funded and the equitable student share is in place, the state will be contributing on average, or actually across all institutions, about 57% of the cost, or about $14,000 per student, while the equitable student share is about $10,000 per student. So it really flips over who's responsible for paying what in public universities, but also that we should be spending significantly more than we are today. So that's the concept. This varies pretty significantly across institutions, depending again on the nature of the student body, the students that they're serving, and the history of funding state appropriation. So turning quickly to how do we fill that? How does the state distribute that $1.4 billion? And obviously no one expects it to be immediately or in one tranche, but over 15 years, 10 to 15, maybe more years. But the commission discussed a couple of ideas about how money should be distributed. Should that the size of the gap for institutions should be a primary focus, but also that every institution should get some money, some percentage increase to help ensure that inflation is being covered. Now there's trade-offs here between equity and between every institution getting something across the board. And that's something that the commission wrestled with, but didn't really land on the percentage increase that should come from the so-called guardrail or the across the board amount. So then just very quickly, the last two things that I wanted to highlight are issues that were not resolved by the commission and remain outstanding. So the first one is medical programs. As we looked at this and as the commission looked at this, the model wasn't working well for medical programs where the cost is substantially more than was embedded in the base costs and the other factors. And so the commission looked at what should be the right cost for medical programs. And there was different data from a national comparison versus what we are facing with our own institutions. And so at what level we should fund them was still an open question. The models that you see assume this $160,000 or the 11 times the base cost. That's what's incorporated in the models, but we note everywhere that that was unresolved. So that will go to the legislature, as will all of these recommendations, for consideration. The final item is the question of endowment. And the commission did not come to a resolution on this, but offered these three options: that 4.2% of the endowment, which was based on the national average, would be what would be assumed that institutions would make available in their resource profile to cover adequacy costs. And then you can see the other two options here: to exempt a portion of it before tapping into the endowment, or adding fundraising costs to help institutions build their endowments. So I think with that, I also have the list of the adequacy gaps here, but I'll save that and be able to share those slides with you all in the future so you can spend some time with it. But a super quick run through of all of those key concepts. And let me pause and stop sharing here. because we hit a lot of things and we're going to unpack this and really dive in and discuss. So what I wanted to do first was just invite President Freeman, maybe you can start then President Gatrell. Just tell us a little bit about your institution. Not everybody may be familiar with your school. So just tell us a little bit about it and sort of how this is relevant to you.
So Northern Illinois University serves about between 15,500 and 16,000 students. About 3/4 of them are undergraduate. We are a residential campus located about an hour west of Chicago. Our student body has a significant number of students who are first generation, who are low socioeconomic status as indicated by eligibility for Pell, and who are students of color. And all three of those categories were just over 50%. And we are also, I think, the only public university whose demographic makeup actually mirrors pretty closely that of our region, state, and a growing change in our country. So that if you look at our students of color, who are, again, just over 50% of our total student body, we are at 25% Latinx students. So we are an emerging Hispanic institution. We've maintained a Black student enrollment of 20%, a little above 20%, and we're about 6% Asian. So we have a highly diverse student body. Is that enough, Ginger, or do you want to hear more at this point?
I think that's great. I think it gives everyone a flavor of who you serve.
Well, good afternoon, and thanks for inviting me to share a little bit about the Eastern experience. For those of you who aren't familiar with Eastern, we're located in Coles County, about 3 hours south of Chicago. We have 8,800 students, about 1/5 of whom are graduate students. 99% of all of our enrolled degree-seeking students receive either merit institutional aid or scholarship support from outside agencies, as well as federal financial aid. 46% of all of our students are Pell eligible, but our first-time full-time new students, that number's higher at 53%. 54% of our all students who are undergraduates have federal student loans, and 62% of our first-time full-time students. What that means is a formula-based model will provide us with resources. We know finances are one of the biggest barriers to persistence. So when you look at that difference between our overall population and our first-time full-time, focusing on students' equitable share is really critical to meeting the needs of our learners. 36% of our students come from underrepresented groups at the undergraduate level. That's 13% African American, about 16% Latinx. 4% Asian American, and 2.5% that identify as multiracial, and we have another 10% of our student population who are international students. So we have a very diverse community in a rural part of Illinois, but we serve the entire state. And so when we think about what this formula means to us, it could have a tremendous impact on the lives of our students, both for persistence as well as just their overall ability to enter the workforce debt-free or with substantially lower debt. So it'd have a huge impact. And I know Ginger shared that slide. We're at 61% adequately funded based upon the model. So we have a lot of work to do, and we certainly could use your support and passion behind this initiative, because it does make a difference for first-generation students and students from across the state of Illinois.
Thank you. This funding commission and the need for equitable public university funding obviously didn't come out of a vacuum. The history of state funding plays into it here. Can you just each talk a little bit about, just super quickly, what the history has been and why a formula may be important as you look at kind of where we are today? President Freeman, do you want to start?
Sure. Let me say that everyone, I think, knows how desperately the state of Illinois needs a funding formula that's rational and that can be explained, and that addresses those three goals of adequacy, equity, and sustainability or stability. The state disinvestment in higher ed started probably around 2010, 2012. The initial reaction of Northern Illinois University and many of our sister universities was to make up the difference in what we were losing from the state by raising tuition. But you get to a certain point and you can't do that. You've priced yourself out of the market, and even more important, you're failing your public mission of access and affordability. NIU had recognized that. We were holding tuition flat. We were looking at how we could be more efficient in our operations and continue to serve students and provide them with the aid that they needed when the budget impasse hit. And when you lose 70% of your appropriated funds, and that's one of your two major funding sources, you find every piece of efficiency that you can find while you're struggling to keep the doors open. And so any reserves that we had, any waste that we had was very, very heavily impacted. We had strong motivation to become more efficient, but it also caused us to live closer to the line. And I think everyone here knows, without me going into great detail, that we were barely recovering from the budget impasse, which was particular to Illinois institutions when COVID hit. And it impacted public universities and higher education across the country. But again, as always, the students who are the most vulnerable are those who come from low socioeconomic backgrounds, minoritized communities, students who are first in their families to go to school. So we are even further away from our adequacy gap than EIU is. I'm feeling that threat right now as we try to deal with the FAFSA fiasco and we think about what it might mean to get through the next year. And so having a formula that funded us and recognized us, recognized the fact that the students we serve, for us to meet them where they are and really take advantage of their assets and talents, it requires that we can offer them the services that they need to succeed, and that costs money. Our mission makes a difference. We're a high research activity university. We offer students from diverse backgrounds a lot of different experience. That counts. And then I think, as Ginger already said, size counts. So I think a formula that considers all of those factors and can be explained to people so they understand what's going on is going to be a great asset to our institution, but also to higher ed across Illinois.
And I would sort of, I don't want to sort of go over the history, but I think it's important to realize that a funding formula for us, is critical to making sure, not only the strategic plan of the IBHE is advanced and that we have an inclusive economy for every learner and every citizen, but as we move forward in the demography of our state changes, we need more learners at a higher percentage to go on to post-secondary education. And that's going to require resources. And if we look at the demographic cliff a few years out, that stable funding that focus on equity and adequacy are going to enable our institutions to compete and thrive in a very different environment 10 years from now. So I'm excited that the state is asking these questions, putting it out there, and having an open and honest dialogue about equity relative to our students, but also our economy and how do we fund and reach adequacy for every institution.
If I could just add one thing to what Jay said, I know many of the people on this call have seen the slide deck from the Latino Policy Forum, and there's a slide in there that I really like to point out, because when everybody goes, oh, the demographic cliff, we're really talking about, yes, a number of decreasing high school graduates, but we're really worried mostly about the high school graduates who come from families with privilege, the students who have always attended higher education. And there is a lot of opportunity now and going forward of students who have been historically overlooked and underserved by our higher education system to be the next generation of leaders. And I don't think we focus or talk about those students enough. And the funding formula gives us an opportunity to do that.
Great. Let's pull in Pranav, who is was one of the co-chairs of the commission. So do you want to just talk a little bit from your perspective on what you see as some of the strengths of the commission recommendations, and maybe a little bit about what it was like to help co-chair this work? I think you're on mute still.
It's only been 4 years of Zoom. I should know that by now. Good to see you, President Freeman. Good to see President Gatrell. So I joined. So when I became chair of IBHE, sort of one of the benefits of that position was you became one of the co-chairs of the funding commission. So I got involved in this in fall of last year. So I described it to the commission. I was the member of the group project who showed up right before it got submitted. And when I think about this, is what I thought was powerful, especially coming in not quite cold, like obviously we've gotten some updates from Ginger over the last 2 years, but really seeing the depth of analysis that had been done to sort of figure out, like, how do we accommodate the diversity of the institutions that we have in the state, and how do we accommodate the diversity of the students that are at those institutions? And that's diversity in every way that even sort of Ginger referred to at her opening comments, where we needed to build this formula in a way that institutions could have sort of a reliable sense of like how many dollars are coming to us, particularly when there are increases in the state budget. And how do we know how that money is derived? Is it plucked out of the air, or is it based on rationale and some research base? And I think when I got involved and got a couple review opportunities with HCM, who were the consulting team who facilitated the process, I was encouraged to see that we were pushing, I think, significantly on recognizing that there are populations that have been underserved in the state and nationally, but we're obviously concerned about Illinois. And we need to create opportunities to make sure that the institutions that are serving those students really well have the resources they need to do so. So I think that was the part that was most sort of compelling for me. The other pieces that I just note, and since I sort of do a version of this kind of work in my day job, I think I was really impressed with the how we went back. So there was a commission. We also had a technical working group of the commission, and the sheer depth of knowledge and effort and labor and time that went in with that group plus the full commission is just remarkable. Like, we always remember that when these things happen and when they're done well, and by well, we mean we have lots of engagement, lots of stakeholder input, lots of voices at the table. Everyone's volunteering in this situation. No one's doing this for compensation. Everyone is sort of taking time out of their day job, out of their weekends, out of their evenings to figure this stuff out on behalf of students in Illinois. So I think that was a piece that was most powerful for me to see really come to light when I did get more involved in the commission.
Great. One thing that I want to add, just in terms of the model itself, and I think President Freeman touched on this a little bit, which is to me, there's real power in the notion of building out what institutions should be spending, that notion of an adequacy target, because in a time when finances might be challenged, or the state might say, well, we'll just fund higher ed as kind of last on the list because it's not mandated and for a whole bunch of reasons. By having an adequacy target, it says this is the path we should be on. This is like we are marching towards adequate funding, and it isn't just kind of, well, whatever money we have to allocate. And I think that's very different than how other states have done their funding models. Many states do have equity-based funding models, but they're essentially, how do you distribute dollars equitably? I think this is the first time that we've really seen, and as I mentioned, it really is built on the K-12 model. What should we be spending for higher ed, for public universities? So to me, that's one of the really powerful aspects of it that I just wanted to elevate. And I don't know if there's other things that kind of jump out. I know we touched on a few of them, but President Freeman, President Gatrell, anything you would highlight as other like strengths in this model? There's so many, they don't know where to begin.
I feel like the strength is really in the large mission, the innovation, the things that you and Pranav have already talked about. So I don't have a lot more to add, other than, echoing what I said before. I think it's really important that we have a model that addresses adequacy and equity and stability of funding, and recognizes that adequate funding gives you good outcomes.
And I would say the two strengths from just a conceptual as well as operational perspective would be a focus on mission, how our missions vary between institutions. It's acknowledged, it's embedded within the formula, and it's meaningful. And the second piece is it centers our students, our learners. It really focuses on the student as opposed to the institution per se. We get to the adequacy thing, right? But we get there by recognizing that the student is at the center of this dialogue. You know, and it is complex, certainly all formulas are, but I think at the heart of it, understanding mission and how that differentiates our institutions, as well as putting the students first, is the power of this framework.
Great, thank you. So let's flip to the other side. It's not perfect. It was, you know, there's outstanding issues, as I mentioned, and there's areas that are, you know, all of these new concepts. So let's just be honest and acknowledge that there's challenges here. What would you point out? What would you want people to know? This does have to go through a legislative process. Are there particular areas that we can do better in as the discussion turns to the General Assembly? Anyone want to start?
You know, you raised the unresolved question of how endowment should be considered as a resource. And I can speak not only for NIU, but the 12 public universities are in agreement that option 3, as presented on the slide, where the adequacy of your fundraising infrastructure is considered in the adequacy target, and endowment is not considered as a resource that can be used for operating expenses for the university. And, you know, Ginger, your slide highlighted one of the concerns, that our donor base would be turned off by the idea that if they gave money, we might get less money from the state. But I think the other piece that's important to acknowledge is the reality that our endowment funds are restricted. The structures of our foundations are different. Our access to those funds for operations are very limited, in some cases non-existent. And so I think that's why there's unanimity across the universities for option 3, which really would allow all of us to rise.
And additionally, when you look at the role endowments play, they play a significant role in supporting our learners as part of their equitable share. And so I would hate to see institutions with robust donor-supported scholarship programs essentially be taxed twice, right, as a result of having a significant transfer of scholarship dollars. Our scholarship dollars transfer at about $4.5 million a year based upon growth, not including current use funds. You know, and that has a tremendous impact, particularly on our returning students, but also our new first-time full-time.
So Pranav, how did this end up in here? What was do you want to speak for a second on what the argument is for including it? Because that was.
Yeah, I think the part of this was this sort of intuitive understanding of that there's income that derives off the endowment that we think is appropriate to apply to how we think about how costs of delivering student services and student education is covered. I do know that, you know, several of the cautions that both of our presidents shared were certainly shared by several other presidents. So I can vouch for that point because I spoke with several of them on this exact point from this very room, in fact, unless I happen to be in their offices, where, you know, there are a ton of restrictions on endowments. There's a ton of you know, donors have very specific intent on where the dollars go, how they're used. You know, they could be dedicated to a certain, you know, to the engineering school, to the medical school, something very specific. But I think the basic premise was this was you know, just like the other revenue sources that we identify in the model, this is a potential another revenue source. And we want to also recognize that institutions, particularly with significantly larger endowments, understood the role that those dollars could play and how they're thinking about supporting students.
I sort of made you answer do the point counterpoint, but I don't.
Yeah, that's great. That's great.
If you want, so thank you for doing that.
Of course.
Is there anything else you would
I mean, I think
highlight?
what I think back to, and I use the content when I'm in the course that I teach at Kellogg, is that I think we are once this goes through the legislative process, the big challenge for all the stakeholders involved is how do we communicate this effectively. You know, several of the folks have been involved with this for 2+ years, and their depth of knowledge is considerable, particularly those in the technical working group, many of the presidents who provide. But we're going to have to get to a place similar to what you all did with what Advance did with the K-12 funding formula, and being able to really clearly share that information, like visuals, infographics, all that good stuff. I think that is going to be a very significant next step once we get through the legislative process, once we decide what the end version of this formula is. Because it is, I will say on my own, for my own sake, like it was a very steep climb to sort of get to a level of like basic understanding, I think, of what, so I could be sort of a productive member of the commission and a co-chair. But I think for us to be able to communicate this more broadly, I think that's going to be the biggest challenge. I think, you know, HCM had noted several times that there are other formulas that are much more complicated, which is remarkable to me. And I think we have the opportunity to say, like, our formula is complex by design because it is trying to address a lot of needs and to recognize a lot of these differences, a lot of different institutions. And the challenge for the group will be to say, like, okay, once we get to a stage where we have something that's in legislation, that we're in a good position to be able to communicate not only the inputs, but what the desired outcomes of the formula are. Because that's in some ways, in my world, what it's designed to do, what it's actually designed to accomplish is much more significant. But we also have to be in a position to be able to explain the mechanics of it too.
So now you say that, now I do want to talk about one element of the mechanics, but now I feel bad because it's
No,
not keeping it
please,
at a
please,
high
please.
level. But I think it's worth. just
Welcome to CCAP's Unscripted.
That's so I think one of the areas that I wanted to highlight, and I just touched on it super quickly, is this notion of a portion of whatever new money goes out, going out across the board versus going out to kind of fill the equity gaps, and recognizing that some institutions are much further away from being adequately funded than others. Does anybody want to kind of comment on, I think there's a tension between those two, and the commission, while didn't really resolve the what percentage should go out across the board, kind of said, well, we need a little bit of both. Anyone, do you want to react to that, kind of how the allocation model looks right now? I know it's a little bit of mechanics, but it is important because it's how every dollar, you know, every marginal dollar goes out the door. So any thoughts on that one?
You know, I think that if we really want to talk about adequately and stably funding our institutions, the formula needs to be linked to a commitment, to a timetable, and that inflation has to be factored into how we're funded. A hold harmless to our 20 whatever it was levels 3 years ago when we started. Our appropriations aren't keeping pace with inflation now, but we have to pay our employees competitive salaries. We have to buy commodities in the market that are sold at inflationary prices. So the less equitably funded students fall, less equitably funded institutions fall further behind as the inflation gap grows. We're all falling further behind. And then Ginger, as you so eloquently reminded us, we don't have a dedicated funding stream for higher education in Illinois. We saw what happened during the budget impasse. There's an opportunity there to look at doing things differently. And I think, you know, one of the things that bothers me when we're in this discussion about, you know, how do you distribute the funds when there aren't enough? We should be focusing on the fact that there aren't enough and there's not a commitment, because there's not the same commitment across the Illinois General Assembly or the Illinois general public to higher ed that there is to K-12. And so assuming that we will pass the formula and the funds will follow seems kind of scary, I think, to all of the presidents who have to balance the budgets and take care of our students and run our businesses. So I know that that had been a contentious issue, but to me, that only scratches the surface of the issue of the formula is one thing, the funding is another.
Yeah, I would say, you know, making sure we establish a baseline hold harmless point, whatever fiscal year that is critical. But having a commitment to deploy that formula in a sustainable, fundable way and knowable way is critical, because moving towards adequacy doesn't get us to where we need to be if we don't have the confidence as an ecosystem across the state that we're going to overcome inflation, right? Which is a really critical thing. Just, you know, this year, we know that's a challenge, as it has been in prior years. But I'm comfortable moving forward as aggressively as possible once we have that commitment.
So how do we communicate this as it goes through the legislative process, Pranav, to your point of making it simple, making it understandable, helping our members of the General Assembly kind of understand the goals and practices that are outlined here. Any thoughts, anything, and anybody wants to share?
I mean, I thought what was most compelling for me when we got to it was once we just started walking through some real examples. Like we can say, here's like the variables and here's the sort of charts and such. But once we said, here's what it meant, here's what it means to these institutions, then I think it gets a lot more real for folks. I'd be remiss if I didn't echo the point of like, we have to make sure the money's there and we have a clear timeline on when the money will be there, while we're also doing this work on the formula. So I think those are parallel tracks in my mind. And it's, you can have a perfect formula, but if there's no money, it's immaterial, right? It's a fun math problem and there are cool slides, but we didn't get to the thing that we actually care about, what we're trying to accomplish. I do want to echo that point. But I do think like walking through the examples was critical. And I do think, I'm guessing a lot of folks on the call may have seen this stuff, but I do think really what Advance did around the K-12 and how to explain the K-12 funding formula was very helpful for folks. It took a lot of the details and like sort of, I'm sure what was similarly a lot of spreadsheets and PowerPoint slides and turned it into some really powerful visuals. So I think that is an important skill set to make sure we have somewhere in the mix on this team as the work moves forward. But I think for the if I'm a legislator, I'm naturally going to care about the institutions that are where my constituents go, or institutions that might be in my legislative district. So I think being able to explain that really clearly becomes probably a top priority. And I know we've done some work around sort of building some one-pagers at the institutional level, which I think could be powerful.
Great, thanks. Anything else you want to weigh in on either?
I would just say that when you're talking about early childhood or K-12, you have parents' voices, you have teachers' voices. We have the opportunity to really use our students' voices, and I think they were very compelling in public comment as the funding formula commission was meeting. And then, this time of year, I'm sure, Jay, it's the same on your campus. We're starting to have all of the pre-commencement celebrations. We had our Latino graduation. We've had our undocumented student graduation. We have a few more coming up, and seeing those students at the microphone and seeing what the education has meant for them and for their families and communities, how transformative. I think those are voices we should unleash on the legislature.
Well, I know we want to leave some time for questions. So one last question for all of our panelists before we open up to anyone in the group who wants to raise some questions. But this audience always wants to be helpful. I know many of you have presented before. So as the state, moves forward in this, how can the folks that are part of CCAPS, how can they be helpful? What would you want to ask them to be thinking about and doing? Pranav, do you want to?
Yeah, I would actually just echo President Freeman's comment there, is that, they're working with tons of students who are hopefully they or the future students that will be entering institutions or the future beneficiaries of these supports. And I think they can be a really significant voice. I know a lot of the organizations that are listed here do a lot of work to make sure that financial obstacles are not financial obstacles do not prevent persistence and do not prevent success. And this is a way for us to, at a systems change level, to start addressing that in a meaningful way. So I think that a lot of the folks on this call are the experts in how do we make sure that low-income first-gen students are enrolling in higher education, persisting through higher education, succeeding in higher education. So I think that expertise can be really a powerful voice as the legislators are considering the funding formula.
Great. Anything? President Gatrell, you want to weigh in on? You look like you're ready, poised to jump in here.
Well, I would say, any support in terms of both messaging to the individual sort of unique constituencies of the organizations, having a multi-pronged collection of stories and experiences to different audiences is critical. That's sort of the power of organizations like this and the members of it. being able to identify different communities that we can speak to and enhance support. I think, you know, being from downstate, which, you know, there's a lot of downstate from Charleston, but I guess I am technically downstate. The reality is we need to create new relationships and partnerships across the state, because we need to leverage this for every community, whether it's, you know, Edwardsville or Macomb or Charleston or Springfield and Carbondale. This is going to be impactful for the entire state. And so any partnerships the folks here might have across the state will be critical too.
Thank you. President Freeman, anything you would want to add?
No, I'd actually like to hear from the CCAPS members.
That's great. Yeah, we can turn it to you with your thoughts and how we might share more information, but also take any questions. So Mara, do I turn it back over to you at this point?
Sure. I'm going to give anybody who has a question, please feel free to chime in. As you know, I always have lots of questions, but I want to give everybody else a chance to chime in first.
I have a question. I new friends and old friends who I see on the call. Are there proposed revenue streams that you think might be viable or realistic to implement some of this funding that will be included in the recommendations going forward?
It's a great question. The commission did not talk about any kind of revenue streams to support it. I think it focused on the why and the how of the funding formula, and did emphasize some potential target increases needed each year on the spending side, but didn't really address revenue at all. I don't know if anyone else would add anything to that. So,
You know, I guess what I would say is when you think about the funding formula, which does not address revenue streams, but does put a very big price tag on adequate funding, in the overall context of Thriving Illinois, the strategic plan, there are places in Thriving Illinois where there are suggestions made about how institutions could collaborate more effectively, could share services or purchasing, or you know, find shared efficiencies. And I don't want that to distract from the importance of and the urgency of the funding formula. But I do think that honestly, we should be saying that we're also willing to look at those things to manage the cost while we try to serve students to the best of our ability.
And I would say while revenues aren't necessarily discussed, I think that the potential power of the formula is it results in us moving from a model which is across the board to one that will have a differential impact based upon sort of the adequacy gap between institutions. All things remaining stable, if we increase 2% per year, hypothetically, you know, those institutions have the highest gap or largest gap would be most positively impacted.
Hi, everyone. Jonathan here from Braven. I'm curious if you, I know it's a completely different context, but I remember a few years back, it might have been in 2014, 2015, Chicago Public Schools similarly, right, went through, or frankly, the state went through the process of developing a new funding formula for K-12. And I'm curious if the committee looked at that as an example of you know, an approach you might take to sort of bring others along in terms of getting them to understand the new structure, what this means for the state, et cetera. I know in some cases there were some real wins, and frankly, in some cases, real challenges.
I would say yes, absolutely. As the commission began its work and looked at models of other ways other states fund public universities and higher ed systems, we also heard from folks about how the K-12 funding formula works here in Illinois. And I think that model, with its focus on adequate, equitable, and stable funding, married with what the legislation called for and the principles of the strategic plan, really led this group to focus on the model that we landed on, which is adequate, an adequacy target with equity embedded. So it very much, I think, echoes what is done in K-12 here in Illinois and why it's so different than what anybody else is doing around the country in higher ed. So we hope
Thank
it's
you,
equally
Ginger.
successful. we hope to ride that wave, right? Like that we hope that that the lessons and what people learned from the K-12 evidence-based model and how successful it really has been when you talk to school districts across the state and looking at the number of districts that were below 60% adequacy, you know, in 2017 compared to now and what it's meant in terms of dollars for districts. I mean, it's really, really powerful and has made a huge difference. It's been funded. And I think if we can carry that forward on the public university side, it'll be a huge win.
Thank you, Ginger.
Hello, everyone. My name is Pam Johnson-Davis, Director of Student Support at One Goal. I've been able to attend a few of the commission meetings this year, and I'm also part of the Coalition for Transforming Higher Education Funding in Illinois. As a person who often sits right across from students and manages work streams that directly impact students that are going to colleges across Illinois, at NIU and EIU, I have students at both. The question that I always leave these meetings with is, how would I explain this to a student? They are a big part of the work that everyone has been doing over this last period of time and thinking about how we can make college affordable for them. And when I sit across from a student, they don't understand all of the adequacy terminology and all of the things that we say in these meetings. And I've had students attend the commission meetings and coalition meetings. With the student, they are sitting there looking at a bill and they're saying, my tuition has increased again. I don't know that I can stay here, but my cousin has a school in Michigan that she's going to that's more affordable, and I'm thinking about going there. How would you explain that to a young person? Like, how would you explain the work that we are doing to a student who's not going to be able to quite always follow all of the adequacy terminology that we use in this spaces? How would you tell them that this was helpful or useful for them?
Well, my hope is it would be transparent to them from the perspective, you know, and we really focus on reducing the overall net cost of attendance for learners and have as significant of an impact we can for students with the highest need across the state. Obviously, you know, yes, you can find less expensive tuition bills in other locations, but the amount of significant support the state provides for MAP and other pieces, and that growth in MAP support has been critical to really every learner at Eastern who is a recipient. So we've seen increases there. So, you know, as we focus on the equitable share, that percentage of students, what proportion of the bill, the overall cost of attendance should decrease over time because there'll be increases in MAP and so on. My hope is that a student doesn't have to worry about the formula. They get to stay in the state of Illinois and focus on thriving here. So, you know, yes, it's a win for students, and for those that might be policy oriented, I encourage them to get out and say yes. But for the vast majority of them, I would hope this would be invisible to their experience, and they just get to benefit from enhanced resources at every university across the state.
Did we want to take one more question? Is there one more?
I think we might be at time. So if there are no other questions, I'll go ahead and close us out. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We want to thank our speakers from the Illinois Commission on Equitable Funding of Public Universities. I think this is really a great conversation and a great overview, and hopefully some of us can help do the work of distilling and sharing that information to students, parents, community members, and folks who this will really be impactful for. If you're interested in hosting a CCAPS event, let us know, reach out to us. If you're interested in sharing some of your work with CCAPS, reach out and let us know. CCAPS is a learning community, and we love to learn, and we love to hear, and we love to uplift the work happening by our different CCAPS members. So thank you all for joining us today. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.